Rashmi said, I am a professor in the geography department at the University of Vermont. I'm a climatologist by training. And so what I do on a daily basis is to actually teach about weather and climate and using things like satellite imagery and trying to understand the world around us so that we can then take that information and use it in jobs, in careers, in answering questions about the environment, in answering questions about climate and climate change. And so what you're seeing here is an image. Actually, it's probably one of the last times that we got to do a field trip just before the whole COVID-19 pandemic hit and everybody had to try to go to remote and online learning. And what you're seeing here is we were able to visit the Burlington International Airport, where we were able to learn about all of these instruments that are used for measuring things like temperature and winds and pressures and rainfall, so that, you know, when you get a weather forecast, these are some of the instruments that are used to actually collect a lot of that information. And so what climatologists and meteorologists do is to study the weather, to study the atmosphere, to make predictions, to look at them over a long time period so that we can understand how our climate is changing. And then with that understanding, to be able to take climate action. So just a little bit more about who I am. This is a very, very busy slide. I don't expect you to read anything on there, just some key pieces that I want you to take away from. Every state, almost every state, has what's called a state climatologist. So I'm the state climatologist for Vermont. And I'm currently privileged to be the president of the State Climatologist Association. And so what I try to do is to make sure that everybody who doesn't know that we have a state climatologist in your state can actually reach out and learn a little bit more about that. And because I've been so involved in working with climate change, climate action, climate education for so long, I try to spread the knowledge that I've gained over the last few decades in a number of different formats. And one that might be of interest if you're thinking about climate change and working through climate change is something called the National Climate Assessment, which came out 2 years ago, and I happen to be the lead author for the Northeast chapter on that. So I just wanted to kind of give you a sense of some of the various things that I do as part of being a climatologist and what that might look like. So when I think about why do I do what I do, how did I get there from here, one of the things that is really, really important for me is to always be asking questions of why. Why are there patterns? Why are we seeing different parts of the globe change at different rates? Why we care about something like methane? What's so important about looking at Arctic sea ice melt? Okay, what are some of the things that are important for ecosystems? So for me, the driving question is always why, in the best sense of the word. And that sort of keeps in mind the need to be always intellectually curious about how things fit together and how does our landscape sort of play out. So if I think back to where all of this kind of started, I think it was really, really fueled and pushed by the fact that every single class that I had in high school, every single subject, every single stage, it was always the importance of being challenged, okay? How are you doing? Can you do better? How are these pieces kind of fitting together? And so that importance of always having, you know, a bar to sort of reach and be sort of striving towards that is I think one of the important pieces that allowed me to be where I am today. And part of that was always having a role model. Who's the teacher? Who's the person that you sort of look up to? Who do you go and ask questions of? Who do you have as what's called a mentor? Okay, who's your guide? Who's the person that you trust almost implicitly to help you answer those questions? And I grew up in Trinidad, which is the southernmost island in the Caribbean. Excuse me. It's just off the coast of Venezuela. And the high school system, the elementary grade school system in Trinidad and parts of the Caribbean is actually based on the British system. So what I was able to have was what's called integrated science. So I was able to do biology and chemistry and physics and geography in ways that allowed you to see what the connections were across the board. And so that ability to see the forest and the trees, I think, goes back to the educational system that I grew up in. And also part of that, also because I grew up in the Caribbean, I think what it allowed me to do is to have a greater cultural sensitivity, which is critically important, especially in these times and in these days where uh, part of this particular session, as Rashmi mentioned, is about not just climate change and climate action, but also bringing ethnicity and race and cultural perspectives into what we do. And so that ability to be always sensitive to other people and where they're coming from is also part of who I am because of where I grew up. And then the last piece in all of that is one of my core values is giving back to the community. And so I've been very, very fortunate and privileged and blessed in having so many good people who have helped me sort of see the trajectory and the ways and the understanding and getting to know myself better. And so for me, now that I'm a professor, part of what is important for me is to then turn around and give back to the community itself. And so that's a piece that I think is a core value based on how I grew up and the experiences that I had in high school. So when I look at the 17 goals, the 17 sustainability goals, where do I sit? Where do I resonate? And I think the ones that are most important for me are, of course, quality education. But that quality education then has the responsibility of allowing you to take your understanding, allowing you to take all of the things that you've learned in class out of class to be able to use that to take action in terms of addressing climate and climate change. So 4 and 13 sort of go together for me from an intellectual perspective, but from a core value perspective, 5 and 10 are also critically important to me because of the need for making sure that we have equality across gender, whether it's in wages, whether it's in professions, and also how do you use that drive for equality to reduce inequalities. So if I had to sort of narrow in on which goals I work towards or try to embody, it would be 4, 5, 10, and 13. And so if we kind of work through this for a little bit, as a climatologist, as a meteorologist, traditionally, those fields, those jobs, those disciplines have tended to be male dominated. And so when you look around and you look to see how many female climatologists or meteorologists you might see on TV, or that you might actually know, or that you might see in a conference, traditionally, that has been a smaller number. It's been getting better with time, with the last few years or so. But here's an interesting little cartoon in this infographic on the left-hand side that shows you some of the proportions in terms of males versus females and why we might want to make sure that we are thinking about gender equality as one of those sustainable goals. And so what I always try to do is to look around to see what the challenge is and then try to do something about it. So to go back to the goal of racial inequality as well as gender equality, what I was able to do was to get together with some colleagues and to get some funding from the National Science Foundation to create a program called the Diversity Climate Network, or the ClimeNet. You can find it on Facebook. I'll show you that in a sec. Make sure you go and you give it some likes. And the whole rationale behind the ClimeNet, which I thought was, kind of like a cool title, you can tell me if it's not in the chat afterwards, was to try and allow K through 12 students and undergrads to learn a little bit more about climate, to learn a little bit more about geography, because you can't pick a major that you don't know about. And so what I would do is I would literally go into various schools here in Vermont, but also across parts of New York City to actually talk about weather and climate and what you could do with that as a major, and what are the connections with your chemistry classes, what are the connections with your bio classes, your environmental science, environmental studies, and how all of these kind of go together. Remember, integrated science is one of the things that I'm particularly interested in. So how do we bring all of these various pieces together? So when we did that, one of the grads involved in that particular program, he was able to sort of come out and visit my classes. So he was at the University of California in Los Angeles, and he was able to come out and visit one of my classes and talk to my classes and do that mentoring from a peer perspective. So somebody who is closer in age to my undergraduates were talking about the work that he was doing, and that's a critically important way of sharing and helping that sort of movement along a particular trajectory in here. And when we look to see how did I get involved in all of this in the first place, part of it was due to this gentleman here, and you're getting a sort of preview snapshot because of how my graphics card is suddenly acting up here. But just this gentleman here, his name is Dr. Warren Washington, and he is a climate scientist who is very well known for looking at climate change and working through and helping others understand about climate change. And he is the one who really got me going in terms of thinking about that connection between climate change, and diversity. And the neat part about him is his work was honored by former President Obama in receiving the Medal of Science. And as of right now, he's the only African American scientist to have ever been awarded the Medal of Science. It's the highest honor that you can receive in the US for the work that you do in science. And so, you know how they say you're always like one person away removed from somebody really, really famous. So we in the climate like to show this particular slide because of all of the work that Dr. Washington has done for the last 52, 53 years in helping diverse students, diverse populations learn about climate change and become mentors themselves. So if you think about it, how can you actually sort of get into this area of climate variability, climate change, maybe thinking about a career in education? And so some of the things that I think are important are to think about some of the classes that you might be interested in, the classes that you might be taking right now. And if you are fortunate enough to have a geography class in your school, great, take a look at it, maybe explore it. If you have environmental sciences or environmental studies, maybe take a look at those and see what's involved in them. If you have some math classes, physics classes, if those are of interest to you, you probably could take a look at those. And if you're really, really fortunate, and this is where having your knowledge of the state climatologist can come into play, if there are not internships at your particular school, see if there's a professor or somebody else, maybe the state climatologist in your state, who might be looking for somebody to help them as a volunteer. So volunteer to work with a scientist is another piece in there. And then when we think about how do we ask questions about the environment, how do we ask questions about the landscape, a lot of it has to do with thinking about where things are on the landscape. And so that's what I mean when I say to think spatially, okay? Where are things located on the landscape? How is this all fitting together in a three-dimensional perspective so that we can understand various elements of how climate change affects different parts of ecosystems and so forth. And as we're looking at it and thinking about it, one of the skills as a climatologist, as a meteorologist, is to be able to see like the individual details of something, but then to take a step back and see how those details kind of fit together. And so again, for me, there's that integration, that integrated science piece that becomes important. And so, you know, if you're doing a Google search and you're trying to see climate, climatology, careers, some of those pieces, you might run into National Geographic has an awesome careers page, as does PBS Nova, okay? And then finally, the American Association of Geographers is also particularly interested in helping students coming up the ranks sort of learn a little bit more. What does it mean to be a geographer? What does it mean to be a climatologist? Okay, so these last three on here, National Geographic, PBS, especially the NOVA series, and the AAG, the American Association of Geographers, have some awesome resources in terms of careers. And so when I talk about thinking spatially, these are some of the things that we can look at, okay? This is something called science on a sphere. So science on a sphere, and it is either through NOAA, which is this first acronym here, or through NASA. And you can actually either visit some of these, like once we are able to travel, as we get through the pandemic and we're able to travel and actually visit some of these locations. This is literally like a huge room where you've got this massive globe in the middle. And what they're doing is they're shining all of this information onto the globe itself. And the globe's spinning at the same time, so that you're actually seeing how the science moves and evolves as it kind of goes through, okay? So when I say spatial thinking, this is what I'm looking at. How do things change in various parts of North America? What's going on with hurricanes and typhoons in the Pacific? And as the thing spins, it gives you a different perspective on understanding how climate change is impacting various parts of the globe itself. So for me, what's the most fun? What's the most rewarding? And I think the answer to that is working with people, working with students of all ages, working with teachers, learning about what are some of the things that you're learning about in class, and how can some of the things that I know about kind of intersect, so that we can learn about, you know, how things change through the atmosphere. For example, if we did a balloon launch, and these are party balloons, okay? Literally stuff that you can get at the store down the street. If you put together some of this and you launch it, how can you learn about changes in temperature as they go up through it? Like, we did this with some 4-year-olds, and they were like, give me data, and writing down what those numbers were so that you could see how the temperatures are changes as you kind of go up through the atmosphere, which is awesome. And then across here, what we have are some frisbees that turn every time you take them out into the sunlight, because they're sensitive to ultraviolet light. And these are like wicked cool because they help you learn about different kinds of sunscreen. You can put sunscreen on them, and you can see what happens when you put sunscreen to help protect your skin. And then, you know, as you get into things like learning about climate change and how that affects things like algal blooms and blue-green algae, you can make these observations that are out in the actual environment itself. If you're fortunate to have a lake or a river next to you, we can do a lot of these types of observations, which is great. So I think I'm gonna stop here, and I'm gonna leave this up for you, so that, you know, if you want to send me an email, if you want to get a hold of me, if you want to ask me questions once we're all done, you know, we have our breakout chat rooms. But if you remember something after and you're like, oh my goodness me, I want to send her an email, I want to give her a call, I just thought I'd leave that there. So I'm going to turn it back over to Rashmi and Kelly and Francis, and I hope this was what you had in mind. I see Kelly doing me like this, so hopefully we're good.